Well, I was having coffee with some of the adults during the Sunday school time a few weeks ago, and we were discussing how one of the biggest considerations when you are expecting a new child is their name. After all, it's going to follow them for the rest of their lives on certificates, official mail, passports, school attendance lists. And at the same time, they're also going to pick up many other nicknames, titles, and terms of endearment over the years. Which is why you really want to make sure you give your kid a name that's hard to make fun of. And so when Natalie and I were expecting our first child, Ellie, we thought we had done due diligence. It was the only name that we both liked, and so we thought long and hard to make sure it didn't rhyme too easily with anything unpleasant. I really have no idea how we missed smelly. It may be because Ellie's name is supposed to be pronounced with a French accent as Elie. And so it's unlikely anyone would rhyme that with Smelly. However, because of my Anglophone influence on the household, we more often refer to her as Ellie, and for that reason, even more often as Smelly. But that's actually far from the end of her nicknames. For some reason in our family, Ellie in particular, like the last thing she ever gets called is her actual name. I actually most often greet her as Eleanor. And when people hear that, they ask, "Oh, is that what Ellie is short for?" Nope. It's just the rare elongated nickname. Natalie, on the other hand, she started calling her Ellie Lou Who when she was very young. This is after Cindy Lou Who from the story of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. And for some reason, this has also evolved into Natalie simply calling her Lewis. So in our house, you may hear Ellie or Smelly or Eleanor or Lewis called for dinner, and the same lovely young woman will take her sweet time showing up at the table regardless. So this morning, the reason I begin this way is because we're going to be talking about the disciples of Jesus, the 12 disciples in particular, what they represent, what their role was, and what they tell us about what it means to be disciples of Jesus ourselves. But the reason I want to talk about names to start this morning is because I wanted to just address off the top of our time together how hard it really is to remember the names of the 12 disciples. Do you know what I'm talking about? I mean, if I sat down with a pen and paper, I don't think I could name them all, even after studying the subject all this week. It feels like even more of a challenge than trying to name Santa's 8 reindeer or Snow White's 7 dwarves, but it also feels more challenging than other famous biblical lists like the 10 Commandments, or even naming the books of the Bible feels easier to me than naming the 12 disciples. And I think there's a simple reason for that. And that is how common it was in the first century to be referred to by multiple names, titles, nicknames, and linguistic variants of your name. And as a result, if you were to go through the New Testament, we would find that we actually have at least 21 different names that represent this group of 12 men. Take Peter, for example. The name Peter, you may have heard before, comes from Petros, the Greek word for rock. But the nickname that Jesus likely actually gave him, as we see it used in the New Testament a few times, is actually not the Greek word for rock, but the Aramaic word for rock, which is Cephas. If you're curious, by the way, this is a bit of an aside. Aramaic is not something we talk about very much, but it's essentially the language that the Jews learned when they were in Babylon. And it was still the basis of everyday language. It was sort of the common tongue spoken in Judea by the Jewish people in the first century. And so it's the language that Jesus would have been speaking most of the time, which is why we see it show up every once in a while. It shares a fair amount in common with both Hebrew and Arabic, sort of in the same way that French, Spanish, and Portuguese share the same Latin roots. So While Hebrew was the traditional language, Aramaic was the common tongue, and Greek was the language of government and commerce, and that's because of Alexander the Great. But you can see there's a lot of influences there. Now, if we get back to Peter, Peter is originally known as Simon, but even this would have been a Greek version. And so that's probably what was written down in the Greek New Testament, and his name was probably, actually, almost certainly, Simeon, which is the Hebrew version of that. And that version doesn't actually appear anywhere in the New Testament, possibly because there are several other figures who are named Simeon. Do you see what I mean? 3 or 4 names that refer to Peter alone. So I just want to take a quick look at the rest of the list here. So we have Peter's brother was Andrew, just Andrew, and he is actually the only Andrew in the Bible. So that's actually pretty simple. It's almost the only simple one. James and John, they come next, but they're also known as the sons of Zebedee or the sons of thunder, which we're told comes from a nickname. I've been trying to work on my pronunciation of this one all week. Boanerges. It seems like scholars aren't sure if that one comes from Hebrew or Aramaic, but it means sons of thunder. But then John also referred to himself in his own gospel as the beloved disciple. So we have that name as well. And then there's Philip. And Philip is sort of another straightforward one. However, it becomes sticky because there's a second separate Philip in the book of Acts. And we meet the second Philip when he is chosen as one of the 7, along with the more famous Stephen. And these are the 7 who were chosen to care for the daily distribution of food. And it's never actually, I don't know if I could have gotten to the bottom of this, but it's never actually been very clear to me which Philip has the famous encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. It's one of the Philips, though. So if you're trying to keep track, we've covered 5 of the 12 so far. Next, we have Thomas, who we're told is also called Didymus, which apparently means the twin. So he possibly had a twin sibling, I suppose. They just say Thomas, who was also known as Didymus, and they never explain why. After that, you also have Bartholomew, but Bartholomew is also sometimes called Nathaniel, depending on which book you're reading. Followed by Matthew, who is also sometimes referred to as Levi, and then the other James, which makes things difficult, of course, but he's often known as James, son of Alphaeus, or even James the Less, or sometimes James the Younger. But it should be noted as well that neither of the disciples named James are understood to be the author of the book of James in the New Testament. The letter is attributed actually to one of the brothers of Jesus who was also named James. He later became the head of the church in Jerusalem, and he is mentioned quite a bit more in the New Testament than the other 2 disciples named James. After the second James, you have Judas, but not the famous Judas. This is Judas, get this, son of James, a different James than the other 3 James mentioned so far. And this Judas probably, because he shared the same name as the betrayer, is also known by 2 other names at times. Most translations mention him as Thaddeus, but some, such as the King James Bible, follow a textual variant that lists him as Lebbeus, whose surname was Thaddeus. And then after that, there's a second Simon in the list as well, often referred to as Simon the Zealot, most likely implying that he had been part of an anti-Roman political military movement. And then finally, we have the infamous Judas Iscariot to round out the 12, also called the betrayer. And Iscariot, if you're curious, is a word that means a man of Kerioth, which is a place in the region called Moab. And interestingly, this makes Judas the only member of the 12 that wasn't from the region of Galilee. So all of that to say, it makes sense that it's hard to keep these guys straight. They have too many names. But as we've already seen, some of their names were also really common and overlapping each other as well in that time. So besides the 2 disciples named Judas, there are 5 other people referred to by that name in the New Testament, including another one of the brothers of Jesus to whom we attribute the book of Jude. There are also at least 5 people who go by James in the New Testament and no less than 8 Simons. And of the 12, only Matthew, John, and Peter are biblical authors. Matthew and John each wrote Gospels, and Peter wrote 2 letters that we have in the Bible. And only 3 of the disciples are ever mentioned by name at all past the first chapter of the book of Acts. So none of them even hardly appear after the Gospels. And even then, one of those 3, which would be James, the brother of John, he's only mentioned another single time in chapter 12 of the book of Acts when he is executed by Herod. So this means that it's really only John and Peter who take center stage as the leaders of the early church. They're the only disciples who are mentioned by name in most of the New Testament after the Gospels. And of course, they take leadership along with Paul, of course, gets mentioned a lot, and James, the brother of Jesus, gets mentioned quite a bit in the New Testament. And yet we also know that this doesn't mean that the others became unimportant. They are still mentioned as a unit, as the apostles at times, as the elders of the early church. And with the exception of Judas Iscariot, of course, they are generally understood later to be the apostles. So I have to say that as we continue on this morning, I think we'll see that although we often don't know much about most of these men, they are still important. Their roles were important, and they were important in what they represent to us. So I want to get into that. We'll hopefully leave most of the sort of nerdy Bible trivia stuff behind and get into a little more helpful information here. But we're going to be dealing with 2 texts today from the beginning of Mark as we continue to work through the book of Mark. And one will be carrying on in Mark chapter 1, where we've been for several weeks. And that'll be Mark 1, verses 16 to 20. And this is where Jesus calls the first 4 of his disciples into his service. But I think it would make sense for us to start with our second text for today. So we're actually going to start in Mark chapter 3, if you'd like to follow along in your Bible. Mark chapter 3 is where we find Mark's official list of the 12. So that after everything we've just covered, we can sort of sort through and recognize which names and titles he actually gives us. So this is found in Mark chapter 3, verses 16 to 19. I'm reading from the New International Version. It says, "These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." So that's Mark's list. Let's just take a moment to talk about the number 12. Because it can't possibly be a coincidence. And yet, like many significant biblical numbers that we've explored in the past, it's never directly explained to us. We can assume that it's related to the 12 tribes of Israel because that is the only other 12 of any significance in the whole Bible. In fact, the number 12 appears about 73 times in the Old Testament. And while some of them are coincidental, like sometimes there's a couple of instances where they'll talk about the passing of a year by saying after 12 months had passed. Or there is one of the kings of Israel took the throne when he was 12 years old. Those aren't necessarily significant in the same way. But at least 51 of the occurrences of the number 12 in the Old Testament are symbols or direct references to the 12 tribes of Israel. And those 12 tribes came from 12 men, the 12 sons of Jacob, who was also called Israel later in his life, which is where we get the name of the Israelites. So there's really no mistaking the meaning of Jesus selecting 12 men to set apart from his other followers. And that's important to note. Because as we read the Gospels, we discover that there were way more than 12 people following Jesus from place to place on a regular basis. It's not like 12 was all that he could get. He chose 12 specifically and set them apart from the rest of his disciples. In fact, while I'm sure there are many disciples who came and went over the years, and we also know of figures throughout the New Testament who were sort of disciples, but they stayed a step back. They weren't public disciples, like Joseph of Arimathea, who was kind of a secret disciple of Jesus. By Acts chapter 1, after the resurrection, we're told that there are about 120 men and women counted as part of a group called, at that point, the believers. And this is why in Acts 1:21, when they decide that they need to choose someone to take the place that was left by Judas, they're able to choose, it says, one of the men who have been with us the whole time the Lord Jesus was living among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. So what we realize there is, again, it wasn't just the 12. There were other people who were there the entire duration of his ministry, from the baptism all the way through. And they chose a man at that point whose name was Matthias. And although we never hear about Matthias again after that point, we just learned that we never really hear about most of the rest of them either. But they are still there acting as the elders or the apostles of the early church. So it is true that it's true though that during his years of ministry, Jesus often only would have had the 12 with him. We do see that in some of the stories we read in the Gospels, that it was just the 12 with him. Or sometimes he had only a smaller group that was just Peter, James, and John with him. The story of the Transfiguration is an example of that, where he just had this smaller subgroup with him. And yet, generally speaking, there was a much larger, dedicated following. But there were 12 who were set apart on purpose, representing a symbolic remnant of Israel, or maybe you could say the elders of a new holy nation. And you may wonder if these new 12 possibly came from one from each original tribe. I think that's an interesting question that occurs when you talk about the 12 disciples being representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's like, well, did one of them come from each of the tribes? And I think that's a really fair question, and it would make sense, but it's actually fairly easy to realize that this isn't really possible, since there are at least 2 sets of brothers among the 12. And each of those sets of brothers couldn't realistically represent more than one tribe because they would have had the same ancestry. But even further than that, as you read through the events of the Old Testament, what you actually discover, we don't really think about this very often, but what you actually discover is that most of the tribes aren't actually very intact with a clear individual identity by the time Jesus begins his ministry. We don't have the time to go through all of the sordid history, of course, but it was essentially just the tribe of Judah who went into exile in Babylon and made it back to Jerusalem. Most of the rest of the tribes had broken away from the house of David in the time of Rehoboam, who was David's grandson. And that northern kingdom, it ends up being conquered and scattered by Assyria. And this is actually why modern descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or modern descendants of Israel, are called Jews. Because Jew is short for Judahite, specifically, rather than the collective Israelite. I think you could even technically argue that all Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites were Jews. Although that sounds kind of strange, and I said it to myself over and over again, thinking, like, is there any way this sounds anti-Semitic? I don't think, it just seems like it could be saying something like that, but I don't think it is. I think this is accurate. But while the word Jew does appear in the Old Testament, it's not actually used until the parts that take place when the kingdom of Judah in particular is in exile in Babylon. And it's in Babylon, in books like Esther or Ezra and Nehemiah, where you start to see them referred to as Jews. And yet these 12 men in the Gospels do represent all of Israel. They are still the remnant of Israel that's spoken of in the prophetic books, God's chosen nation of priests. So then the number 12 expressed through symbolism essentially what Jesus claimed to be and what he had come to do. That he was, in fact, the divine messianic king of Israel, the heir of David, who ruled over all of the tribes, and who was now coming to set up the kingdom, whose coming had been foretold by the prophets. So other than representing Israel, what was the role or the purpose of the 12? Let's back up a little more in Mark chapter 3 to consider that question. So we'll go to verse 13. This is the passage that leads directly into the list that I read earlier. And these 3 verses just say this. Jesus went up on a mountainside, and he called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach, and to have authority to drive out demons. So in this passage, we can pull out 3 aspects of the role of the disciples. First, quite simply, that they might be with him. Literally, companionship, fellowship, practical support. Just a little bit earlier in chapter 3, you see Jesus send his disciples. This is before the appointing of the 12, so this is in the larger sense of the group of disciples. He sends his disciples to secure a boat because they have need of a boat. So they were doing the practical stuff. But they were also there to be both students and witnesses of his ministry. See, in that era, like I was explaining to the kids, to be a disciple was to learn at the feet of a rabbi or a teacher. They were apprentices, they were students, they were interns, but also they were friends and family members to Jesus. The second thing it says in this passage is that he might send them out to preach, which is something we see during his ministry at various times, and also as his final instruction to them in Acts chapter 1, to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. In fact, the Greek word here is what I was talking about with the kids earlier, if you were listening to that. To send them out is apostelleo. Apostelleo. Let's try that again. There we go. Apostelleo. And it's where the term apostle comes from, which means that at this point, as an aside, this word means one who is sent out. And so you could argue that Judas Iscariot was an apostle. He was one sent out by Jesus. And after he did what he did, and after he took his own life as a result of those, the guilt over that, they replaced his position as an apostle. But also, the third point made about their role is that they would have authority to drive out demons. And that one can be hard for us to relate to, because not many of us have ever witnessed what we would understand to be an irrefutable experience of the demonic. And yet, I'm sure we've all heard secondhand stories, especially from other parts of the world. And you know what? We're going to keep encountering stories about driving out demons as we study the book of Mark. In fact, the very next story in Mark chapter 1 is a story of Jesus driving out an evil spirit. So we need to try and wrap our heads around this a little bit before we move on. I'm sure many of you have thoughts about this. You've thought about it before. I'm actually always really interested in your perspective on these sorts of things, and I'm sure some of you will have thoughts or stories to share with me after the service, but I would suggest we think about it this way. This is what has made sense to me and been helpful to me over the years. And this is to say, in the Gospels, we see Jesus interact directly with demons, speaking to them, commanding authority over them and casting them out of people who are severely afflicted by these evil spirits. It's not spoken of in symbolic terms. It's not in veiled language. They're saying this is absolutely what is happening. Sometimes he is speaking to them and they are speaking back to him. But not every encounter he has with sin in his ministry and the effects of sin and people being affected or controlled by sin involved him casting out demons. For example, he also refers to many of the religious leaders in fairly demonic terms as well, especially if you understand the language that he's using. When he refers to the Pharisees as a brood of vipers, or when he says that their mouths are like open graves, or that they are like whitewashed tombs, he's using very spiritual language. But even though he addresses them in this way, you never see any supernatural spiritual activity in those encounters. Another famous example is when Jesus accuses Peter of being under the influence of Satan. He actually says, "Get behind me, Satan." And this happens in the book of Mark, in Mark 8. And this is when Peter tries to convince Jesus to stop all of the talk about dying, tempting him to depart from the path that he knows he needs to be on. And again, in this instance, even though he accuses Peter of being under the influence of the demonic, there's no exorcism in that instance at all. So what I'm trying to say is that there are plenty of times when spiritual oppression or influence are present without it being an instance of what we would call possession. And that being said, I do personally believe that spiritual activity which is opposed to God is happening today and is everywhere in our world. But we don't all encounter it in the same way. And I think this is because we aren't all vulnerable in the same way. I'm not saying we are not all vulnerable. I'm saying we are not all vulnerable in the same way. For example, as individuals, when it comes to the temptations of sin, I might be more vulnerable to a love of money. You might be more vulnerable to issues of anger, or maybe issues of unforgiveness, or maybe a struggle with shame. And I think the same is true on a cultural scale. Just as individuals are different, I think there are different scales in different cultures. I think the reason that there are parts of the world who still seem to experience negative spiritual manifestations and activity is because as a culture, they are still receptive to it. They still have a supernatural worldview. I would say this is basically similar to the understanding that there are entire cultures that are a little bit different than our culture who are more susceptible to the bondage of what we call an honor-shame system of morality, for example. And so I suspect that the enemy rarely bothers with such supernatural strategies in the West because we're all skeptics. We all think of ourselves as enlightened and scientific. And besides, we're far more vulnerable to things like pride and greed. We are so naturally dismissive of the spiritual that we either explain it away too easily or the enemy simply doesn't bother because it's far simpler to just lead us toward destruction through pleasure, power, and money. Or to simply convince us that there is no spiritual realm at all and therefore no danger to worry about. Does that make sense? I'm not giving you hardened doctrine here. I'm giving you sort of my own understanding of these things. And yet, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we experience it with our own senses or not, the Bible is clear that the spiritual does exist and that there are powers in this world that are opposed to God's will. So then we need to think about these stories from a perspective that understands that, rather than just saying, well, that part of what it means to be a disciple doesn't apply to us. Because whether Jesus and the disciples were literally casting out demons or healing the sick or challenging hollow and idolatrous religion or holding each other accountable for their own weaknesses, what they were doing was always the same. They were always fighting back against the chaos, against the wilderness, against the power of death. They were spreading the kingdom. They were pushing back the darkness. They were cultivating God's peace by setting people free from bondage and multiplying their numbers so they might fill the earth and subdue it. And in this way, you can think of the 12 disciples like the 12 tribes of Israel, crossing the Jordan, entering the promised land, pushing back the dominions and authorities of the false gods that are opposed to the true God in order to reclaim the kingdom and the people of promise. And I think you can see this in our earlier passage, or our second passage we're going to look at this morning that comes earlier in Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 20. I'll invite you to turn to that if you're following along in your Bible. So this is what it says. This is Mark 1, verses 16 to 20. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Now think about this famous passage, the classic description of Jesus making his disciples into fishers of men. I'm sure many of you know the classic Sunday school song. I'm not going to lead us in a rendition of that at the moment, but it's a famous one. Obviously, he's turning a clever phrase here because these first 4 disciples are fishermen by trade. But think about it even just a little bit further. Think about exactly how clever it is, what he's really saying in light of what we've covered so far in recent weeks in this series. Because to fish for people comes with the image of drawing them out of the water. Now, when you draw a fish out of the water, it doesn't really end well for the fish. But that's not what's going on here. Because if you remember, when we talked about, especially about the baptism of Jesus, but even the time in the wilderness, you need to remember that biblically, whenever we talk about the water of the sea, it represented chaos and death. He's going to teach them how to draw people out of the chaos. He's going to teach them how to deliver people away from the realm of death. He's calling them to a new vocation. We don't use that word a whole lot. To us, it usually means what we do for a living, vocation. But in reality, the roots of the word vocation has a deeper sense of meaning and purpose and maybe even suitability. It comes to us from Latin, actually, and it's a word that means work that is our calling. It means to be called to something. Not just to do it for a living, but to feel called to it. So then in Ephesians 4:1, for example, when Paul implores us to live a life worthy of the calling you have received, in the Latin Bible, which is called the Vulgate, the word would have been the vocation you have received. And I believe that here we have the 12 as our examples. You see, in Mark 3, Jesus went up on a mountainside, and it says, called to him those he wanted. He was inviting them into a new vocation. And although these men did literally leave their day jobs behind to immediately respond and follow Jesus, I don't think that is actually the core lesson here. I think the real lesson is that we have a vocation that is bigger than our occupation. If you were to take a quick look at Exodus 19, it's up to you if you want to flip there or not. We're not actually going to read too much of it, but in Exodus 19, what you find there is this is the moment when Israel has first arrived at Mount Sinai after the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea. And at verse 5 of Exodus 19, he says to his people, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Priesthood is a vocation. It is a role to be fulfilled. It is a work to be done. It is something you must be called to. Some of the Israelites were set aside to be priests in their occupation, but all of them were intended to be priests by vocation, by calling. They were intended to move into that promised land and be the blessing to all nations that God intended them to be. This was God's commissioning to Adam even, to move into the earth, to fill it, to subdue it, to multiply, to be fruitful. And it is still God's plan for his people. And I think that's what the 12 represent for us when we think about what it truly means to be a disciple of Jesus. No matter what our social status or no matter what our occupation day to day, our vocation, our calling is threefold. Just like we see in Mark 3. First, to be with him, to be in relationship with him and fellowship with each other, to do the practical work of service that makes his ministry possible, to learn from him, to sit at his feet, to bear witness. Second, that means to preach the word. Maybe not always how I'm doing it right now from a stage in front of a congregation, but to bear witness to the gospel as we go out into the world. And then third, we don't want to forget about the third, to draw people out of the chaos, to fight back the darkness, to bring hope and spread God's peace however we can and wherever we can. Mark 3:14 says, he appointed 12 in the NIV, and other translation options primarily say he chose 12 or he established 12, or in some of the older translations even it may say he ordained 12. But the Greek word here is actually the word made, as in the word used of the work of an artisan. Like an artisan would make a clay pot or a work of art. He made them. He transformed them. He recreated them into his disciples. And I think that's important for us to remember, that we don't choose our vocation. It's a calling. We need to respond to it. Again, it says Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He called. They came, and he made them. So our question this morning is, how will we respond to this same call? Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for those 12, for what they represented, who they were, what they were willing to do, Lord. The example they are to us. And Lord, when you call, may we come, that you might transform us, to be with you, to bear witness to you, and to drive back the darkness together, God. In your precious name, amen.